In today's Focus at 4, we're taking a look at the shooting at a church in Charleston, South Carolina that killed 9 people. Those funerals will be held throughout the week for the victims. This mass shooting has also started a new wave of, we'll call it soul searching about Americans' racial conflict, and there is much to talk about.
Yeah, there's a lot happened over the weekend and especially today. A lot of discussion and debate about the Confederate flag. In fact, just within the last hour or so, the governor of South Carolina joined several people, including 2 senators from that area, Senator Graham being one of them, and basically said, look, the Confederate flag must come down. And again, that just breaking in the last hour or so, the governor of South Carolina saying Confederate flag has to come down. Now, this is right after last week's massacre, the shootings at that church in Charleston. In that case, as you now know, the shooter was white, the victims were all black. Well, over the weekend, yesterday, President Obama went on a radio interview. It was with a comedian. And in the discussion about race relations in America, the president used the N-word, and that has ignited another wave of debate, controversy. So we're going to start our Focus at 4 here with a look at what all's happened here in the last 24, 48 hours. Hannah Daniels has more from the White House.
President Obama says the legacy of slavery and discrimination still casts a long shadow. During a podcast interview in California, the president said the country is not cured of racism, and he used a heavily loaded word to make his point.
It's not just a matter of it not being polite to say in public. That's not the measure of whether racism still exists or not. It's not just a matter of overt discrimination.
The president spoke just days after a white man opened fire at a Bible study at the Emmanuel AME Church in South Carolina. Dylan Roof is accused of murdering 9 people.
President Obama says there's no doubt attitudes about race have improved in the last 50 years. But he says societies can't simply erase hundreds of years of history overnight.
In Charleston, Mayor Joseph Riley has promised to fight the forces of racism and keep the community united. But he agreed with the president's view, even if his use of the N-word was jarring.
I don't fault him for that, and he was, working to make a point.
The White House says the president was making the point there is more work to be done to wipe out symbols of racism. South Carolina is taking up that debate as it relates to the Confederate flag. Many lawmakers say such a potent reminder of slavery should no longer fly over the state capitol. Hannah Daniels for CBS News, the White House.
Because here's the thing, many people, including right here in Texas, see this Confederate battle flag as really just a symbol of the South, Southern pride, and we are so proud to be Southern so often, and they don't see it as much more. They watch Dukes of Hazzard reruns, that famous Charger General Lee. They see restaurants around town with the Confederate flag. They see big department stores selling items that have the Confederate flag, belt buckles, boots, whatever, with this symbol.
And we talk about South Carolina. It is a symbol here also in Texas. There's the history element to it, but many see this as a symbol of slavery. There is the hate aspect that goes into it. And a lot of people, including the governor of South Carolina today, saying it should go, especially from government buildings, because indeed the Confederate flag does fly above the South Carolina State Capitol building and was the only flag there last week that was not lowered to half staff after the shootings of those 9 people in the church. Now, that is because, we'll give you the backstory here, that the reason that didn't happen is because it would have taken an act of the state legislature to get that lowered.
So as the people of South Carolina mourn this tragedy that seems to have been fueled by racism, they're seeing their own government fly the flag that was once the flag of the movement to keep African Americans actually enslaved in this country. So to many, this seems like an obvious slap in the face to African American people, but to others, it's also a matter of freedom of speech.
Right, and even more so, a matter of remembering a piece of history and remembers the people who died fighting in a war that they believe. For example, Texas Senator Ted Cruz, he made the comments on the campaign trail that this is all a question for South Carolina. Basically, Senator Cruz saying, you know what, this is going to be up to the states. They need to be making these decisions. In fact, here's what he said, and I'm quoting here. He says, I understand that the passions that this debate evokes on both sides, both those who see a history of racial oppression and a history of slavery, which is the original sin of our nation. And we fought a bloody civil war to expunge that sin. But I also understand those who want to remember the sacrifices of their ancestors and the traditions of their states, not the racial oppression, but the historical traditions. And I think often that this issue is used as a wedge to try and divide people.
And it is certainly dividing folks right now. Former governor of Florida and Republican presidential candidate Jeb Bush took to social media to tell the American people how he feels about this. Now, I'm quoting from his Facebook page, "My position on how to address the Confederate flag is clear. In Florida, we acted, moving the flag from the state grounds to a museum where it belonged." This is obviously a very sensitive time in South Carolina, and our prayers are with the families, the AME church community, and the entire state. Following a period of mourning, there will be rightly a discussion among leaders in the state about how South Carolina should move forward, and I'm confident they will do the right thing.
Colonel William Brooks, the head of the NAACP, says this is a debate that is not new to the organization. He also responds to folks who say it's not the flag's fault that evil exists, whether or not the flag flies.
The fact of the matter is that flag represents exclusion. It represents bigotry. It represents bias. There are white nationalist groups across the country who see that flag representing their values. The fact of the matter is our American flag represents the values of the majority of Americans. That is inclusion. That is democracy. That is the spirit of our founding fathers and our founding mothers. That Confederate flag does not represent those values, and in 2015, it's an anachronistic emblem of a bygone era at best, and most likely and most representative, a set of values that run contradictory, that run counter to who we are as Americans. It has to come down. It must come down.
This is a pretty big story, and again, still developing. Within the last hour, the governor of South Carolina saying this flag needs to come down. She's agreeing with Senator Graham, President Obama, a lot of other folks. In fact, she said, quote, "There will be some in our state," talking about South Carolina, "who will see this as a sad moment. I respect that, but know this, for good and for bad, whether it is on the State House grounds or in a museum, the flag, the Confederate flag, will always be part of the soil in South Carolina." That's from the governor.
She's recognizing that history, but also
recognizing it. And even when you talk about Senator Graham and others, they say, look, we understand, we see the history and why there are so many who are still passionate and have pride in flying the flag, but we have to look at what else it means. And that's what the governor's saying. She's saying, you know what, it's time for it to go.
Especially at a state building on those state grounds. But you don't have to just listen to politicians' opinions on this. You can weigh in. We're asking on our Facebook page right now if you think that flag at the South Carolina State Capitol should be taken down. Right now,